good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. You're joining us for the second wave of first SIG updates. We'll be getting started here in just a moment or two. We're just going to wait and let a few more folks kind of sign into the broadcast right now, and we'll get going shortly. So please stay tuned. So just a reminder, we'll be getting started here in just a moment. This is the first SIG update, and we'll be getting started with the EPSS SIG shortly. So please stay tuned for just a moment. We're just giving everybody a moment or two to join us. Let's unmute ourselves first. Good morning. I'm Sean Richardson. I am a member of the board here at First and get to be the moderator for all the wonderful SIGs that are going to be joining us today. Just want to take a couple minutes. Each year we take a little time, normally in person. I've even got on my former First shirt on today for good luck from our last trip, and talk about all the great work that the SIGs are doing. My personal opinion is that the SIGs are kind of the reason we exist. These are groups of folks who come together with an idea of how to make security better across the world. And it can be a group that comes together to discuss and bring ideas up, to create a new document, a new standard, a group that tries to solve problems for specific groups of security workers, all sorts of things. And I think it's kind of the lifeblood of First. I am also the SIG liaison to the board, so I get to interact with all these wonderful folks and hear all their great ideas and see all the wonderful work they're doing. And I really would like to encourage you, if you see something that strikes you as interesting today, please reach out. The SIGs are open, most of them are open for new members. And for many of the SIGs, you don't even have to be a member of First to join. They can let you know that towards the end, but I think this is some real exciting work we do, and I'm happy you're here with us today or watching this recording later. With that, I'm going to go ahead and get started with the EPSS SIG this morning. Sasha and Jay are going to tell us a little bit about what they've been up to and all the new and exciting news there. Gentlemen, please take it away.
And I got unmuted. Okay. I think we're set. And we're sharing a screen. Is that shared?
Yep, you're good to go.
All right. So thanks for joining, everyone. My name is Jay Jacobs, and I'm joined by Sasha Romanowski. You want to say hi, Sasha?
Hi, everyone. Jay, I don't know if the slides are full screen. I see like part of your desktop. I see most of your desktop.
I can try it again. Not didn't look at that either.
Good.
Is that good?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Good. So we got the slides going. So So I think we could probably just jump right into it and start talking about what is EPSS. As soon as I get to advance, there we go. So EPSS, as the words on the screen here say, it's an open data-driven framework for estimating the probability that a vulnerability will be exploited. And this is, there's a long history here working with this data, trying to understand what is going on in this landscape. And our goals are on the screen here as well, and I hate to just read right off the screen, but what we want to focus on is this vulnerability prioritization, because as everybody knows, there is a huge amount of vulnerabilities coming out on a daily basis. I think the last couple of years since the CNA process, the Certified Numbering Authority, I believe it is, when that program kicked up in 2017, where it opened essentially the front door for CVEs, we're seeing 17, 18,000 vulnerabilities per year being published and tracked. It's a huge amount of information for anybody in vulnerability remediation to track, follow, manage, and then prioritize what's going to get remediated first. We also wanted to better understand what the landscape looks like. What is driving remediation efforts? What's driving attackers' efforts, and everything in between? And also understanding things like the vendor's reaction, all this stuff like that. And so what we wanted to do was to create a group to bring together researchers, practitioners who all share this common goal, first to understand what's going on, and then to help people prioritize and help us understand essentially the risk behind these. Now, EPSS is not an encompassing risk-based framework. It is part of a risk-based framework. And so since EPSS is just looking at the probability of vulnerability exploitation, it's going to be missing a lot of the things that individual organizations or people would want to know, such as the value of the asset, what is the impact if this vulnerability is compromised. There's a whole lot of other questions to be answered for that complete risk picture, so we're just focusing on this one aspect, the probability of exploitation. That was a pause in case you wanted to jump in there, Sasha, but I can definitely keep going. So as I mentioned, there's a long history of research. This comes out of research that my day job, Santi Institute, has been doing with Kenna. These reports are freely available. We just released volume 7 today, and we're looking at this sort of understanding the landscape, and Kenna's very interested in that, and that's part of their business and stuff like that. One of the things that came out of that research was a whole bunch of understanding of the environment. But this chart, I think, really talks to the importance of something like EPSS, trying to understand the prioritization problem. This is a plot where each point here is a single company, a customer of Kenna, and they are how many vulnerabilities do they see per month. This is mainly from vulnerability scanners picking up things. So these are the obvious things that the companies are going to be working on. And so during any given month, on average, we're seeing across the horizontal, the x-axis here. So left to right is how many open per month they have. This is across a 2-year period. And then vertically is how many they're closing per month. And what we're seeing, the red line is about 10%. The red line is fit to the data. Really nice clustering around this, really nice correlation between these. And so another thing is that organizations that have over 10 million open vulnerabilities are closing about the same proportion as those with 100 vulnerabilities. And that's a pretty interesting finding. But the other thing is it's only about 10%. Only about 10% of the open vulnerabilities are being remediated per month on average. It goes from 5 to 20, depending on the organization maybe, but largely about 10% of these are being fixed. And so there's an obvious need for prioritization. To get at that, we had a paper presented at Weiss. This is the first paper that we wrote, myself and Sasha and Idrissa Jared and Wade Baker. Idris and Wade from Virginia Tech, and Wade is my partner also at my company. So this paper, though, took a machine learning approach and tried to develop a model looking at exploitation activity in the wild. And we presented it at Weiss 2019 in Boston. Sasha was there. And this is the first look that we had into trying to understand it. This led to a second paper that we presented at Black Hat in the summer of 2019. And later it's been published at DTRAP. Sasha, when did that publish? That was recent?
It's coming out. If it's not out already, it'll be imminent.
Okay. And we formed the first SIG in September of 2019. So, and there's some links on the bottom. We'll have links at the end as well for some of these materials. But where we're headed with this is that the paper tried to develop an approach to this, and we wanted to keep growing that. We didn't just want to throw a paper out there that just said, hey, this would be cool if this caught on. We wanted to try and push that. And so Sasha immediately went into work and tapped into his network and brought together an amazing group of people. The original authors on that EPSS paper are listed here, myself and Sasha Idris again. And then we have Michael Reutman, the chief data scientist at Kenna, and Ben Edwards working with me at the Science Institute. And so these were the original core members. And we've since blown it out into the first SIG that we're going to be talking about here. But I wanted to go into what EPSS is sort of all about, what we're trying to do. And this is a view of what we're seeing in the environment. Basically, out of all the published CVEs, and this is sort of a generic Venn diagram, so for any given slice, if you're looking at, say, 2019 or 2017 or everything since 1999 when the CVE process kicked up, out of all of that, we're seeing about 2 to 5%, depending on the slice, of the published CVEs are actually being exploited in the wild, or there's exploitation activity in the wild going after these vulnerabilities. And so the Venn diagram is sort of representing the challenge that we have. We have very uneven data, that there's a whole bunch of CVEs, but very few of them are actually being exploited. And this is part of the prioritization challenge. When we compare this to something like CVSS, when we look at how would CVSS forecast this exploitability, this is the type of overlap that we're seeing. On the left, you can see if we were to remediate everything that is CVSS 9 and above, it's a pretty large circle, and it gets even larger with CVSS 7 and above, and we'll see how EPSS compares to this later, or how EPSS compares to CVSS later. And our approach is basically to start with data and to build up models, prediction models. And this is sort of a flowchart of what we're trying to do here. The challenge is largely getting data. This is probably our biggest obstacle. And this is not specific to EPSS. This is probably every sort of data-driven effort. The first and largest obstacle is always getting data. And so part of what we'd like to do with the first community is to reach out and say, this is let you know the type of data we're looking for, specifically anything around activity with vulnerabilities. Either the detection of them, the remediation of them, especially exploitation activity. So if you are working in an industry or a company or some sort of a team that's dealing with vulnerability information, that you have evidence of exploitation, whether it's malware analysis and you're working on understanding what the malware is doing, reverse engineering, that sort of thing, and you're discovering that it's possibly exploiting vulnerabilities, we'd love to know about that. If you're detecting malware in the wild, we could then correlate the malware, what they're targeting, with the malware detections. Obviously things like IDS, IPS, host-based, network-based systems, picking up any sort of exploitation activity, all of that information is going to be very, very helpful. We are currently working with several sources for that. We've got Fortinet has been a huge partner. They're really great with their rather expansive network of detection mechanisms out there. We're also working with Kenna Security and the sources that they're bringing to the table. Several companies have exploitation activity. And then we're also getting free and open source related data. So obviously we're watching Matter CVE list, NVD. With NVD, we get some of that CPE information, the CWE, the CVSS information. All of this can be factored into the models that we're building here. as we look at the version 1 requirements in that first EPSS paper, we had very strict requirements because we weren't sure which direction it was going to head eventually. So we wanted to make it very simple to implement. We wanted to sort of target a spreadsheet. If somebody wanted to implement EPSS, they could do it in a spreadsheet. And so we had that requirement up front. We wanted it to be interpretable. So that led to the model selection. We didn't want to do, deep neural networks or something like that, which could be very difficult to interpret at times, and do something rather straightforward. We also wanted to be parsimonious. That is, we wanted to not require people to gather, hundreds of data points and to do all sorts of data prep. We wanted to try and limit the amount of data that is going to be required to run this, and we wanted it to be objective. And things that are public. We didn't want anybody to have to buy a data source or anything like that. And so we wanted it to be very lightweight, with a few variables that were easy to get. And then lastly, we wanted it to do well. We wanted it to perform and to do a good job at describing that exploitation activity. So without getting into too much of the detail, this is a view. I think we started with 50 some variables, looking at how they're going to perform in a model. And this is a view of the contribution or detraction on the probability that they have. Red things were contributing to exploitation activity, blue were detracting. And essentially what we're doing is we're doing a model that penalizes these types of variables. And we're starting over on the left with a very strong penalty. And as we loosen that penalty up, we start to see that variables are overcoming that penalty to contribute to the model. And we developed a threshold here that minimized what's called the BIC, the Bayesian Information Criterion, and the precision recall area under the curve, maximized that one. And so we found a cutoff that maximized the performance of the model, basically. We ended up with 16 variables, and how they contribute to the outcome is depicted here. And so the biggest contributions that we find are when there's exploit code either weaponized in a framework like Metasploit, or there's POC code published to something like ExploitDB that's not immediately runnable, but it can be compiled and or run in a script or something. And then there are things on the lower end that actually detract. So if it's a local vulnerability where you see tag local, memory corruption vulnerabilities, those are typically a little bit harder to script and to exploit. So we actually see a slight decrease in the probability of exploitation when it's memory corruption. And then things like Google and Apple, which I think are interesting. I think Google might be actually sort of an artifact of their integration into the CVE process. So they have a ton of CVEs because they are so tightly integrated. And so when we see a CVE from Google, saying that this is going to be the one from Google that'll be exploited, it's just not showing up in the model. Now, with these, the model contribution here, how to bring all of this together is shown in this chart. The weights are shown. The weights are also depicted in the plot, but here are the numbers. So if somebody were going to plug this into Excel, for example, this is how it would be done. And then all of these things are added up, multiplied and added up into the log odds. And then there's a small formula on the bottom that brings us into the probability of exploitation. So the output is a value between 0 and 1. The performance of this, these are two different views of that, and this can get rather complicated, so I'm not going to dive too deep. But the key here is because we're outputting between 0 and 1, it's not a bucket. So it's not like a high, medium, low thing where you have a large bucket of highs and a large bucket of mediums or something, and you're not sure which to go for first. Because we've got this continual range, people remediating can start at the high end and just go down until they run out of capacity. And as you do that, you're going to have good efficiency, which is a term that we describe in our papers and our material. And then as you get more closer down to the 0 end, you're going to be getting more coverage. That is, you're going to be remediating more and more of those that need to be remediated. If we throw the CVSS scores, because we can look at the same ratings for these vulnerabilities on CVSS, the left curve is a rock curve. We're trying to get into the upper left area. The further into the upper left, the better. And that dashed line in the middle is basically about guessing. It's just random chance. And so both of the EPSS and CVSS do better than random chance. And so this is reaching our fourth requirement about being performant better than what might be out there. As we compare to CVSS directly, what we see is, for example, on the left, we've got CVSS 9 and above, and we're getting about 25% coverage of those exploited CVEs. So we're remediating about 25% of those that are being exploited in the wild. When we take that same 25%, apply it to EPSS, we're going to be remediating things at 0.19 and above, basically on that 0 to 1 scale, or 19.8%. When we do that, essentially we're getting about the same amount of coverage, but we're reducing our effort. And I think that's really where the value add is going to be from something like EPSS. It's this reduction in effort, that people can get about the same level of coverage and remediation from less effort, as opposed to being more accurate and fixing things. This is probably going to be more advantage from a reduction in effort. When we compare it to CVSS 7 and above, trying to repair anything like that, we're down on the low end of EPSS scores at 0.036 and above, and we're getting the same coverage here again, but you can see again it's about that reduction of effort. And Sasha, why don't you jump in on this next slide here?
Okay, so this is an important slide for a number of reasons. So we spent a bit of time talking about CVSS. It has grown to be kind of the de facto way of developing a strategy for patch management, right? So in the early, almost 20 years ago, there was no objective, transparent way of understanding the risk of vulnerabilities. And so CVSS was born out of an effort to create that kind of model. And it started off as we wanted to create a risk framework, right? And so if you look at it, there are 3 components: the base, temporal, and environmental. And you'll hear all about this in the next session. I mean, to go on, but the base score has emerged, for better or worse, as the standard there. Now, and it worked very well because at the time it was the best information that any of us had about understanding, say, the quote-unquote risk of a vulnerability. More recently, in the past few years, there's been sort of some criticisms and a general awareness that look, it's good at understanding the severity, but it's not good at capturing the threat. So what is the probability that this vulnerability will actually be exploited? And so that's the void, that's the gap that we are trying to fill here now with EPSS, right? Being entirely data-driven versus a scoring system of standard that is based on the properties of the vulnerability. Now, if we want to think of CVSS as a way of understanding the impact, so in part, it is a measure of the impact of the vulnerability, and we want to think of EPSS as a measure of the likelihood, the probability, the threat of a given vulnerability, then what we can produce is a scatter plot like this with severity on the bottom and likelihood on the y-axis. And what that gives you is sort of a measure of risk. It's not complete, it's not going to be comprehensive, but it kind of gives you a measure of that. And these points come from real data. And so what they represent are all the CVEs that we've scored, 60,000 of them, plotted with EPSS and the CVSS score. And so what you see, and what this describes, what you observe at the beginning is that a lot of the mass of these vulnerabilities exists down on the bottom, which reinforces Jay's point before about how most vulnerabilities don't get exploited. And so if it's true that most vulnerabilities don't get exploited, then the trouble for the network defenders is, okay, well, which ones do I patch first? Previously, you were telling me that CVSS score is the way to go, but now you're saying, okay, well, look, there's this other scoring system, this probability thing. How do I take that into account? How do I frame this information and how do I present it in a way for me as a network defender where I can develop a better strategy? You claim, you have a better approach here. So what is it? Well, here's a notional representation of what a better strategy could be. Now, the lines, the vertical and the horizontal lines here are arbitrary. as a network defender, you can put a threshold wherever you want. But the point is to say, look, we can kind of, if we squint, divide this kind of representation, this kind of graph into quadrants, right? We can think of this as sort of a risk map, as the canonical risk map, where the stuff on the bottom left is the low that we're not going to prioritize right away. The stuff in the high on the right is the really important stuff, sort of the higher risk things, the higher risk vulnerabilities. And so we would argue, at least I would argue, some may disagree, but I would argue that those points, if this represents your network, that those vulnerabilities in the top right are going to be the ones that you want to fix first, rather than say everything above a CVSS score of 8 or 9 or 10 or whatever. That this gives you sort of better efficiency overall at patching vulnerabilities, because what we're saying is that, look, it's these smaller sets of vulnerabilities in the top right that not only are they more severe in terms of impact to your information system, but they are more likely, much more likely to be exploited. So I would argue anyway that we'll fix these now. The stuff in the top left that I label as deprioritized. So those have obviously a higher likelihood of being exploited, but the impact of the system is lower, right? And so maybe it's information disclosure of a particular user account. It's highly likely to be exploited because there's proof of concept code, because it exists on Microsoft, because it's a web-based component, something. But really the impact of the system and the organization overall isn't that great. So I would argue we could deprioritize those. And there aren't that many of them anyway. The quadrant in the bottom right, where we have labeled watch these, so those become important, right? Those are remote code execution. Those are where a packet launched from across the internet could lead to full compromise of a system. But we estimate, based on all of the data and all of the vulnerabilities that we've scored, that they don't suffer, let's say, a high probability of being exploited. So from the latest information, the prediction score is low, but they still have an impact. So these are the ones we want to watch. Now, there's a great deal of mass down there, right? So in the top right, there may be, for an organization, there may be dozens of vulnerabilities, and maybe hundreds of vulnerabilities, again, just in the top right quadrant. In the bottom right, to watch these, those may be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities, millions of vulnerabilities for a large organization. But by taking this kind of approach, by understanding the information contained in CVSS and the information contained in EPSS and matching them this way, I think this gives network defenders a much better strategy, a much better approach than they had before. I'll stop there, Jay, and happy to take questions that we can discuss after if there's time.
Yeah, and I think the important thing here that I would want to draw out is that EPSS is not intended to be the risk score, right? And so what you're showing here is like, hey, take EPSS and bring in other information. And that might be CVSS, it might be asset importance, data importance, priority, all of these things, right? Position on the network, all of these things are going to factor into a remediation decision. Good.
Okay. Just a reminder of folks, as we're going through, apologies for the interruption, but if you have a question, please use the Q&A functionality at the bottom of your screen, and I will be asking the chairs questions towards the end of their presentation. Thank you.
Great. So let's run through the accomplishments. We've been meeting bi-weekly, every other week, for a little over a year now. We just had our 1-year birthday. Had a little celebration, but data is being collected and processed daily. So for the version 1 scores, those are being produced and updated daily. And actually this link here, this is not public yet, but we are working on updating our web presence, and this will definitely be out there. So if you go to this link, the EPSS scores current csv.gz, you will actually get redirected to the daily score, which will have the date in the file name, which makes it handy for storing. And so that's being generated on a daily basis, and we're working on the infrastructure still and getting that very robust. It's pretty good now, but we certainly have some room to grow. We are working on a new statistics page for the first.org/EPSS web presence. And this also will be generated daily. We're going to be having this automated. So it's going to pick up the EPSS data, some of the CVE data, a whole bunch of other stuff, and pull that together and try to show daily statistics around that. And we've been doing some work on version 2. So it's underway. It's moving a lot slower than I expected, but these usually do. We're removing the requirements to be lightweight and parsimonious and interpretable. Interpretable, we don't want to abandon that, and I don't think we will. But this requirement to put it in a spreadsheet is not going to be something that we want to support moving forward. We're definitely open to discussion about that, and we've been having discussion. But what we're going to look at is probably some sort of centralized API. As you know, you can download the scores now, but something that you could query real time to figure out what the CVE looks like. The advantage there is, part of the challenge that people have with CVSS is that the base score doesn't take into some of the what's that other part of CVSS? The temporal part of it. So, and that temporal is obviously something that gets updated, should be updated frequently. And that's a very difficult thing to keep on top of. And so by moving EPSS to a centralized model, hopefully we can keep that update centralized. And that way, as the landscape changes, the EPSS score will change with it. The chance of exploitation will be going up or down over time, as it does in reality. So the first model 2, we had a very hard limit on the first 12 months of CVE publication. And so that doesn't really help for something in 2017. It might give you a gauge or something like that. But so what we're looking at for the next models, we're looking at essentially survival models is what they're called, or time to event models, something like that. They have a whole bunch of different names depending on the industry it's implemented in. But with a survival model, hopefully what we can do is shift to in the next period, whether it's going to be on the next 30 days, 60 days, 6 months, 12 months, whatever that is. And we're trying to figure out how we want to frame the output of this model. But that's where we're headed to. And this is part of the challenge, because when we move to these survival models, the requirement for the data collection and the data format becomes a little bit more strict. So we have to know precise dates of activity, how much activity and all that stuff, and the underlying base of collection points. So we have to know who did not see it also, which is also a challenge in some of the data collection methods. And just to wrap up on the version 2, this is a early plot, basically showing overall probability of exploitation in the wild, or exploitation activity actually. And so you can see that the dashed line is basically at CVE publish over time, the probability of exploitation for any generic CVE. Obviously, any single CVE will not match this exactly. It's going to vary above or below. But this is sort of a measure of middle of central tendency. This is what we're seeing for as far as probability of exploitation. And the drop on the right is probably because we're our sample gets smaller and smaller as time goes on. And so that I wouldn't read too much into that little hook at the end, but this is what the data is showing.
Well, hang on, let me go back. So I think Jay is underselling the advancements that he's made in this and all of this data analysis. So there has been a long-standing unanswered question about whether or not vulnerabilities are exploited more or less over time, right? Are they easier to exploit? Are they more frequently exploited because code is available, scripts are available, they're easier, people don't patch, whatever, or are they less likely to be exploited because, look, new vulnerabilities come up and people find newer things and people patch, and so the attackers need to keep moving. So this curve, pretty clearly shows that the probability is decreasing in time, which, you know, perhaps we could have speculated beforehand that maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but here's some objective evidence to really support that. And I think that's a pretty important innovation.
Yep. Yeah, there's some really cool stuff going on, but I didn't want to geek out too much. So to wrap up here, and we can open up for discussion, listing the 2 papers here, you can just search for EPSS, and I think those are going to come up. Some of the presentations we've done, Black Hat 2019, Weiss 2019, Sasha did PrivacyCon, FTC's PrivacyCon, and hopefully there's going to be a lot more coming up here.
Let me add one more thing. Jay, can you go back to the slide where you show the distribution of the covariates? Oh, yeah. So so what's very exciting with this, in addition to, you know, us having a probability score that we can share with everyone that you can match with CVSS and whatever patching, what this is creating is, I think, a fundamental innovation in terms of awareness of understanding of the threat landscape of vulnerabilities. And that is not an inconsequential thing. I don't think anyone before has been able to obtain and analyze and present the data this way. And I think that's fabulous. And that, like, that's not just me doing it, it's Jay doing it, it's sort of everyone, and it's a tribute to the entire community and everyone that's been participating in EPSS, and we thank them greatly for it. And by the way, it's open, and if anyone wants to contribute and join our calls and our group in a discussion, you're welcome to. But what this shows is a current snapshot of the threat landscape insofar as the data that we collect, observe, and those data are imperfect, of course, and they're biased in certain ways, and we recognize that, and that's why we seek more data to get a better picture. But based on the data we have, this is our understanding of the most important variables that factor into the probability of being exploited. And this is great. It's great to understand, and it's great to understand the individual variables, to pick those out, to say, look, there are some vendors that are more strongly correlated with exploit, other vendors that are less correlated, or in fact, negatively correlated. There are also certain characteristics. So these words, these keywords here come from the CVE descriptions, right? And so some we would recognize and probably say like, oh yeah, I would expect that. That makes sense. Code execution, proof of concept code. Okay, great. You're not telling me anything new. Well, in fact, I would say that, look, this is, again, it's evidence, and it's subjective evidence. It's data driven, and provides a picture of the current threat. Now, in 6 months, this may change, right? Nobody knows, as far as I know, understands clearly what's going to happen in 6 months in terms of how that threat landscape changes. Our attacker is going to suddenly start using vulnerabilities that they find in network devices and, you know, forget about Microsoft. Are they going to go to Cisco? Are they going to go to other hardware devices and Wi-Fi? We don't know. Is proof of concept code going to, you know, still continue to be a major factor in predicting vulnerability exploit? I don't know. So what we've done now is created an infrastructure and a data processing architecture, let's say, where we ingest these data, and now we can provide this picture on a repeated basis, right? So Jay's doing this daily now, which is pretty amazing in itself. But now what we can see is, okay, let's look at a picture a month from now, then a month, and the next month, and the next month. And you can even imagine a bit of an animation from this, where the, you know, the variables are increasing and decreasing, moving up and down, and increasing in width. And that's a pretty amazing thing to be able to create. And so we're very much looking forward to teasing that out and understanding and hopefully explaining it to get just a better understanding of the motives and strategies behind these exploits in the wild. So I get pretty excited about it, and I hope everyone else does. But I think that's it then.
Excellent, Jay, you're on mute.
Happy to take any questions.
So a couple of questions coming in. One is, as you're looking at this, and I think it's great that you've got this expansion of how you can change things and kind of go and follow as the model evolves. Is some of this dependent upon the descriptions as they are written for on MITRE for CVE? And is there a
Yes.
concern that we're not consistent as an industry in how much detail we give in that information?
Yes. So,
Okay.
so yes, and the descriptions written in MITRE CVE were a lot more consistent before the CNA process kicked up in 2017. And so in
Mhm.
2017, when you get that front door opening up and there are a lot more people writing those descriptions, I don't know what the word would be, the variety, choice of words are subtly different now. But I mean, like, and this is actually just sort of looking for signals. So if you take the word like remote,
Mhm.
there's actually a lot of stuff going behind the scene on these tags. So like, and there's I think we had 192 different tags. And so if you take something like SQL injection, we just didn't look for SQL space injection. We were looking for all variations that people type with that, you know, even SQL dash injection or SQLI or, you know, all the different ways that people say that. And so, and memory corruption or like web, for example, it's not looking for the keyword of web. It's looking for elements of web. There's like 8 different tags behind web looking for browser, you know, page load. There's a bunch of different things it's looking for. So yes, these tags and things that we're pulling out of the description are not perfect by any
Mhm.
stretch. And actually, one of the things we did in version 1 is that we looked at all of the references that MITRE lists and we grabbed, I think, the top, I don't even remember, some proportion of those references, the sources, and started scraping the text there.
Mhm.
So, you know, like security focus, X-Force, I think might have been in there, but there was a whole handful of resources that we were scraping the text, trying to get more words to throw into that bag to try and pull out what does this actually represent? What is this vulnerability doing? And I think we've got a lot more room to grow there. And I also think that something like the CWE process is something that we could tag on a little bit better. But I'm sorry, the CWE, if that's what I said. But the CWE process has a whole bunch of challenges right now and how it's implemented that like NVD is where we get our CWE information, but NVD has its own specific view. And what we see is that some of the CNAs aren't following that necessarily. And
Mhm.
so you get a lot of CWEs, you know, being tagged that are not part of that view. And it's hard to know which view they were thinking. How is it nested? And so it's a little bit of a wild west with CWEs and trying to use them. We got absolutely no signal from CWEs right now,
Okay.
which is a little concerning. But
Do you think that's because the quality or because of the quantity or a bit of both?
I think it's right now sort of the variety of it, and that CWE is that nested hierarchy, and
Mhm.
that I think that hierarchy will change depending on the view of the CWE. And so it's a little challenging to because the model is ignorant of that hierarchy. It'll treat them as a category, and so you know there's somebody may have a SQL injection and it might end up in the data in NVD as having 3 or 4 different CWEs, depending on where someone chooses to put it in that hierarchy. And so that SQL injection may be spread across 3 or 4 different categories in the model, which the model does not interpret well.
Okay. I
There's
know.
a there's a there's a lot of CVEs that don't have CWEs as well, which is part of the problem.
Yeah.
So I think that one of the ways I would comment on this is the CVSS is being written by people, and then we're trying to turn it into something that's machine readable. And so
Yeah.
maybe there's a further discussion about like how would you make machine readable, machine derived, and very consistent tags for CVEs in the first place, right?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
that's kind of an interesting thing. So as we all know, we all wear multiple hats in the industry. I know many of the groups who are members of FIRST, several are also participating in MITRE's working groups. So working to, onboard my CNAs, working to bring up the quality, things of that nature. It seems like it wouldn't be, maybe consider having a connection with those folks and having a discussion with them on kind of what you're trying to do potentially and see if they can come up with a way to encourage, not only encourage
Standardization.
participation, but standardize a little more. I know for us, we are, we have just started adding CW information to our submissions going to MITRE. So it shows up on NBD, and now we're doing the comparisons on the scoring. We're just starting that process now. And one of the things we run into is that we obviously know our mitigations a lot better, and some of which we're, frankly, I'm not going to publicize in an entry. So it's trying to find that gentle balance is kind of difficult. What advice would you give?
Sasha, did you want to take that one?
What advice would I give to improve standardization?
As somebody who, whose company writes some of these, and we're a little nervous about putting too much detail in our data.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know, frankly, if I'm the right person to ask that question.
Okay. I can take it.
I'll defer to Jay.
I can comment too if you want, Jay, but go ahead.
So like when you talk about a vulnerability, there's part of the challenge is that there's multiple aspects to it, and sometimes people will focus on the outcome rather than the, steps to exploit it. So like a vulnerability gets labeled as a DDoS or denial of service or something like that, and that is the outcome. That is not what actually happens. And so like we even have that tag in the model right now looking at denial of service, which is an outcome. And so I think as people are coming up with these descriptions, there's going to be, and there is guidance in the CVE structure from MITRE about how to write those. But I think just trying to understand, like, you've got an attacker, and it might be a trusted employee, it might be an untrusted contractor, all of these different actors that can act on it, whether they're local, remote, authenticated, unauthenticated, all of those things should be in there from the attacker perspective. And then the actions that they take, or do they have to, is it just a packet over the network? Do they have to be physically on the machine? Are they exploiting a memory corruption thing? And I'm sort of going off the top of my head, just trying to think of all the aspects that go into a vulnerability.
A lot of that is CVSS. A lot of that is CVSS, right? A lot of those characteristics of ability. Now there are additional ones too that are being captured, and it would certainly be great if in the description process there were pick lists that people could choose from. Certainly, if that was machine doable, that would be nice too.
And part of the challenge, I think, is that we don't want to create a pick list because 15 years ago, ransomware would not have been on that pick list, and somebody has to update that, right?
You can change the pick list. It's not a static thing.
Yeah. But I mean, it's as a volunteer org, that's yet another thing to throw onto the task list. So
I think too, if you think about the process that we go through, either as companies receiving vulnerabilities from vulnerability researchers or as researchers sending them to companies, the company receiving has a little bit higher incentive to get some of these details right for their customers. But sometimes the vulnerability researcher really does understand the vulnerability better in the sense of its effect, but they don't necessarily understand what's going on under the hood of the product when they exploit the vulnerability. Because if it's JavaScript and I can see the JavaScript and I can read the code and I can figure out what's going on, but sometimes you're working against something that's compiled code or obfuscated in some way or hidden, and so you can't necessarily see that your DOS is really a buffer overflow. You just experience that the application crashes when you hit it and then reboots or whatever. So there has to be better collaboration, I think, between those two. But then stop and think about the numbers. Most people who find vulnerabilities only find a few. And there's a handful of people who do this over and over and over again. And they're probably going to be slightly better at assigning CWE or, different characteristics and working with MITRE or the CNA in question. But most people will probably only find a few vulnerabilities in their life, and they may never have really exhaustively read the CWE list, right? So that's the direction I would go in thinking about how to improve all of this stuff.
I think too, the other thing is the wariness of many vendors on how much information. I've been at places that completely freak out that you release a security bulletin, even though that's pretty typical across the industry at this point. And then they get very careful about how much detail they give, because they don't want to give the bad guys, a leg up. What is it? Patch Tuesday, exploit Wednesday scenario. And so how, the information is helpful, obviously, because then we would know a little bit more what to be wary of. But our worry is that we're arming the other side with every bit of information we can handle. And so how do you try and balance that part?
That's a great question. Aaron, I think you might be the best position to answer that, but I'll take a swing at it first. That's tricky. And one of the things that's part of our discussion is along that lines, like, is the information we're helping, like if we say this vulnerability is rated really high for exploitation, are we basically telling attackers, target this one, you're going to be the most successful, along those lines. But yeah, it's tricky as you're coming up with how much to divulge about a vulnerability. I don't think we have a good answer, and I don't think it's been studied enough.
I've never been convinced by those arguments, right? In every conversation that I've had with people who know more than I do, they always come back and they say, look, the attackers know, right? They know. You think you're hiding something, but they know already. Yeah. Or even if there's a delay, it's a slight delay and it's just not a big deal. And I guess I've come to sort of appreciate that look, it's just, this sort of facade of secrecy that we think that we're creating here to sort of help us is not really worth it. Now, if someone can prove it wrong, right? If there's evidence, I'm happy to take it. But that's sort of my sense going forward. Yeah, Aaron.
And I think your point about data, like you two have a dichotomy here or a discussion going, debate about that topic, and the answer would be to find more data on the topic and study it, as Jay suggested. But I'd also suggest that the information is not necessarily symmetric, right? So you can give information that is only useful to defenders if you think carefully about what you're doing and how you're writing some of these descriptions. And there are places where you could leak a little information to an attacker, but going back to Sasha's point, those attackers are going to tear apart the patch themselves. They're going to tear apart the firmware. So even if you didn't say anything in the exploit description, we're still going to figure it out, because we're going to deep dive on the code and the compiled code and whatever it is that we are looking for in the exploitation process. So I would say just think a little bit more about the information that you provide being useful to the defender, and think about any sort of technical detail that would be useful to them. Because the assumption in a lot of these documentation processes is that you're inspiring someone to patch. But I would argue that there are a lot of vulnerabilities that I may not patch, but I might have a way of blocking at the perimeter, or I may have a way of scrubbing traffic, or I may have mitigations that are not necessarily the installation of the patch. And if more information was released in the vulnerability, I would sometimes be able to write a better IDS signature, for example, or reconfigure the firewall in a particular way, or disable some particular parameter in the configuration. So, if you're nervous about adding more information, just consider adding more information that is mostly useful to the attacker, to the defender.
Yeah, I think that gets back into organizations that are less risk tolerant, than asking, well, heavens, why do I write anything? I don't want, I'll just tell my customers to patch and it'll all be good. And as we know, that's not a good scenario to get into. Vendors, customers, users are not going to patch what they don't understand. I know for years, just anecdotally, my mother would download the Microsoft patches, and it was just like, oh my goodness, because she was scared of the pop-up. Now, obviously, that's not the use case we're thinking about for most of us, but it is that similar thing that most organizations are not patching on Patch Tuesday. They've got to run through tests and do everything that they need to. And having something like this that would help them, if they don't have their own, especially if what's going to be most vulnerable in our environment is pretty useful.
Yeah. We talk about indicators of compromise. I'd like to see something like indicators of exploitation. So like when you write up the CVE, tell me what changes between when it's been exploited or when it hasn't. Is there some extra data that's left over as a side effect of the exploitation? Are there some temp files that exist? You know, and you can't always do that. I'm not suggesting it's always possible, but so much of everyday people's experience of being afraid of having been hacked is that they have no idea how to figure out if they were or not. And I think we're still kind of suffering a little bit from that mindset when we write CVEs as well.
Yeah.
Well, and I think the other side of that too is that how many of us are doing more with less these days? And you know, you're as a vendor, you're just trying to get that darn bulletin out the door. You're not necessarily having an editor or staff member who's dedicated to doing just that one thing. And so it's kind of that last thing as you're getting the train out. And sometimes you just write it and go and don't go back and revisit. And that's why one of the things I recommend to try and get vendors to help improve their quality is doing kind of like the exercise we're doing with the, okay, brave it, start putting out those CWEs, start looking at what your score is versus MVD, and just start getting a feel for how you're being viewed, and what can you do to make that be more clear and more transparent and hopefully better.
Yeah. And you know, the way that even this dialogue has gone is like, oh, are we giving too much information to the attacker? Well, what about giving information to Jay and Sasha and other people who want to put science behind exploitation and probability? And I think a lot of times in this discussion, there's not someone sitting there going, yeah, but what if this became a data set that Dan Geer could analyze, right? Like that's the sort of dream when you're producing these things, is to think about the people who will use it for good as well as the attacker.
And we're also used to thinking about what the worst could possibly happen. I would trust Sasha. Jay, I don't know. Just kidding. Picking on Jay this morning.
Thanks.
But no, this is a great discussion. So one of the other questions is, what are you looking for in additional membership, additional participation? What do you all need?
So I think we're really flexible. You know, anybody, I mean, I hate to put it this broad, but anybody who's worked with vulnerabilities and even just has opinion is welcome, because as probably people have picked up, this is a very, very complex landscape. There are so many moving parts, and there's no way we're going to cover every angle or every aspect. And so, like, even in the group that we have right now in the SIG, you know, we've got various government people in government, and you know, private sector, public sector, and just that variety alone has brought many perspectives that I had never considered. And so I would just encourage anybody, if you're working in and or around this area and you've got a passion for it, absolutely join, because a lot of our discussions are kind of like this, like, hey, what if we, you know, release this? How is that going to affect the attacker? Or, you know, hey, how do we structure this? Are we going to create an API and do we make it like this? Or, you know, how much are we going to share from a statistics standpoint, or how much interpretable do we need the model? You know, so, and the other thing we're doing is that we're trying to bring in other people in the industry and or academia that are doing research around this. And so we've had multiple speakers over the last year talking about research they've done about, you know, a couple of them predicting CVSS scores, for example, before they come out. Aaron, you had great research on, you know, predicting the amount of CVEs before they're coming out, you know, and so we're trying to, you know, broaden the horizon, have these discussions about the vulnerability landscape. And if you want to be a part of that, even if you're not contributing to it right now, we welcome another voice.
That makes actually for a great story. So if we can predict CVEs, if we can predict the CVSS score off of those predicted CVEs, and we can predict the exploitability off of the CVSS and the CVEs, then suddenly we have a whole system that can predict everything before it's even going to happen. We should put all of that work together. That's pretty great.
It's almost like that's a talk coming up at the first conference that all of the listeners might want to join and see. Yeah.
But I'll be more specific. I'll say, you know, what we want are people that can help and contribute to the effort, frankly. It's all a volunteer, right? Obviously. And there's web content to develop, there's slides to produce, there are graphics, there's data analysis, there's all sorts of things. So if anyone has an interest in helping with any of that, that would be very welcome. And also, of course, data. Not to be selfish, but look, all of this is based on data and specifically exploit data. So Jay mentioned earlier that this could come from anywhere. It could come from IDS sensors. It could come from other kinds of malware or other vendors that collect information about exploits in the wild. It could come from network observatories. It could come from honeypots. Any of that and all of that, we would be welcome. I've scrounged around and we spoke with lots of people, and some of it's available, and we're engaged in lots of conversations. But in this case, more is better, and it helps us. It helps the effort. It helps reduce the bias and improves the accuracy. So any of that is welcome.
I'm curious, have you all done kind of a, the term's gonna need more coffee, but I know like the academic SIG, the P-Cert SIG, maybe the C-Cert SIG, kind of go and talk a little bit about and do your stint and see if there's anyone interested from those organizations that could either participate or provide data or something of that nature.
Oh, actually, that's a great idea. That's something else we can do, and I haven't thought of it. That's a great idea. Thank you. Yeah.
We can certainly work on making that happen. I think that's one of the things, as we're doing more together and kind of hearing what each other's working on. It's like, hey, I might be able to help you out, or there might be somebody in SIG who's interested or who could contribute, or so that would be a possibility. The other thing is, maybe we should talk a little bit more if there's any synergy with what the work that MITRE's doing, just to even present to one of their working groups, to just so they're aware, and maybe if they come up with something, you all are at least aware of what each other's doing, kind of thing.
Yeah, we have engaged in different kinds of conversations, but I'm sure there's more we could do. Yeah, no, great suggestion. Thanks.
Yeah.
Just as a reminder for your SIG, people do not need to be members of FIRST, correct, to join and participate?
Correct. Yeah. And we don't have any sort of secret sauce going on. So there's no inside information. We do have some limitations around who has access to the raw data. But I mean, we have a separate sub SIG, if you will, working on the data team, and there's probably three or four of us on there specifically, with a higher level of scrutiny working on the data. But but the general SIG, like, there's no requirements, there's no special sauce, there's no secret stuff being exchanged. It's all open research, open discussion about where we would like to see this prioritization effort go.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, it looks like you all have just gotten a ton of work done in your slightly over a year being a SIG, which I think is fantastic. I'm looking forward to seeing how far you can take this in the next few years. This is exciting stuff, and I think necessary. I think as you stated earlier, is how many patches get released on a regular basis, and it's not all on Patch Tuesday. I know I wish I could do a Patch Tuesday. Just roll it all out on the same day just makes it so much more convenient and predictable. Yeah. But I can't imagine being on the other end of this pipeline and trying to decide what do I prioritize over which. Am I worried about my GPU first over my Microsoft stuff versus my Cisco stuff, or and from my own personal experience, having seen that a lot of folks don't necessarily have the best test bed to start with. Some can't afford to just test every patch, and it's always that kind of roll of the dice to make sure it's not going to break you or make a change that you're not expecting. And so being able to prioritize these things and maybe test those on top of the others would certainly, I think, bring a lot of goodness to the security industry. Yeah. Awesome. Well, we're wrapping up. Any last words for today, gentlemen?
No, thank you very much.
One last thing, I will make another push for data. And one of the things that we didn't touch on is, like right now, a lot of our data is network based, so we're seeing a lot of network exploitation. That's going to be reflected in the scores that we're producing. So if you work in I would say maybe a specialized industry. So for example, ICS devices, IoT, SCADA, any of these things, like I think that we're going to have a hard time initially trying to look at vulnerabilities in these sort of subspaces. Yeah. So if you're working, especially in those fields, we would love to have you participate, even if you don't have data, just to make sure that we aren't totally abandoning these niche markets of security that are often neglected in efforts like this. So at least I'm very aware that we may miss things like the OT market and things like that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Awesome. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it. And if anyone has interest, definitely reach out and join this great work. Excellent. Have a wonderful day. We are going to take a short break. There we go. I have my alarm going off. My goodness. We'll take a short break right now and let the next chairs kind of get up and running and get settled. And we'll be back here in about 5 minutes. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Over to you, Dave and Dale.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Four-letter acronym.
Okay, we'll give everybody a moment or two here to kind of get settled and get ready, and we'll start. And I'm playing around here with my mic. Is that a little bit better?
It sounds fine.
Okay.
That's right. You were a little muted earlier, but yes, you sound better.
Okay, thank you very much. No idea. Went in, tried turning it off and back on again. It seems to work.
Yeah, not sure how familiar we're supposed to be during the intermediate time, but Sean, it sounded to my ear like well, just like I don't know if you have a PC or a Mac, but I probably have 7 microphones listening to what I'm saying now, including the NSA. But many of the mics are pinholes on a laptop that's 2 meters away, and then I've got this way cool overkill microphone that I use for everything else. So it sounds like your headset wasn't being the microphone used, but rather
I'm not sure what was.
Like if you flick your mic, does it make? Yeah, I don't hear that at all. So that's not the one in use. There's some other pin somewhere else that's being used as the primary Zoom mic.
I will try to figure that out. Let me try one more thing.
Yeah, on the mute button, there's a little down arrow, who's you do, and you might have a select your microphone option. Who's you do being a technical term.
Is that any better?
No, sounds exactly the same.
Everything's set to come through the headset. Let's see, let me try one other thing.
So Dale, nice push for your hockey fanaticism behind you. That's well done. I've got let's see, all my Viper stuff is over here, but that's really not an advertisement so much as the only place in the house my wife will let me put the stuff. So
that's exactly it. That's why I got this in my nest.
Okay, yeah, it works out.
I spend most of my day in here, so that's what.
What else is there? Yeah, this
exactly.
12 has been my 14-month sabbatical from reality.
My poster from Preservation Jazz Hall.
Oh yeah, there you go.
I do have my DEFCON flag a little lower because not always appropriate.
If if my webcam was on a swivel, you would realize that I'm also a Simpsons fanatic. I have a Simpsons poster there, and 3 Simpsonized photos that my wife gave me for Christmas that are me and the grandkids, but we look like
In Simpson characters.
Yeah, so that's fairly clever. Again, if we when we go from familiar to professional, then I'll change my voice, but it is one of my passions, or has been one of my passions.
Excellent, excellent. You guys are always fun. So I'm doing the best I can with the audio. So I apologize if I'm sounding like I'm at the end of the well. No clue what's going on. I'll try and fix it offside. But with that, we will go ahead and get started with Dave and Dale. This should be, you would think CVSS scoring, wow, exciting, but there is some really interesting stuff with this, and not to mention the chairs are as you can already tell, very, very eclectic. This is a fun group I got to sit in with these folks and really enjoyed hearing all the great work that they're working on. So I just want to say one thing. If you have questions while we're going through this, please use your Q&A at the bottom, and I will be asking the gentlemen the follow-up questions towards the end of their presentation. And with that, Dale, please take it away.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to present what we've been up to for the last little while. My name is Dave Dugal, and along with Dale Rich, I'd like to introduce you to the state of CVSS to come. As I assume anyone who is on this call, this webinar, is familiar with the common vulnerability scoring system, but it's in a nutshell, it's basically a way to measure the technical severity, threat, and environmental aspects of a vulnerability to come up with a score between 0 and 10 that will give some indication as to the severity and perhaps even the 4-letter word risk associated with a vulnerability. So the agenda that I'm going to cover in our short time is the current status of 3.1, the golden release, the current release of CVSS, some of our approved and proposed CVSS v4 work items to kind of see, what we mad scientists are thinking and how we're trying to move CVSS into the 2020s. The timeline, the things that we have approved so far, and ways to get involved should you be interested or realize the error in our ways and would like to course correct before we come out with the 4.0 spec next year. So the current status of CVSS, 3.1 was published in June 2019. It improved upon 3.0 without introducing any new metrics or values. We're fully aware of the effort required on the back end when the CVSS SIG decides to come out with a whole new set of metrics or values or math. And so 3.1 is simply you would call it a clarification release on 3.0. If you've got backend systems and JavaScript and all kinds of magic that works with the math associated with CVSS 3.x, 3.1 doesn't change any of that. But it does allow for frictionless adoption from 3.0 to 3.1. So for example, I forget what the date in June was, Juniper Networks was able to start publishing 3.1 CVSS base scores and vectors without much consternation by our internal systems or the consumers. The usability was kind of the prime consideration. When you mention scope, everybody kind of wrinkles their brow because everybody who thinks they get it doesn't get it, and everybody who doesn't get it realizes that they're not alone. So we did a lot of work on the example section to come up with more information on scope, a lot of 13 simple scoring guidances for scope, etc. And we defined something called an extensions framework that allows you to plug in some cool things. If you happen to be in the airline industry and you have different metrics that need to be considered when coming up with the final score, feel free to plug in your other way of thinking. And then we have a glossary of terms that is probably a living document that the moment it's published is wrong, but we do try to align with NIST and CertCC and all of the other standards bodies to come up with what is a vulnerability, what is an exploit, what does exploitable mean, etc. So while 3.x worked on scope from 2 to 3, the challenges they tried to resolve were virtualization, because apparently not everything was just a Sun workstation running Unix, but rather there were more virtual entities in the world in the 21st century. Objectivity and repeatability was a big deal, because if you can't do a double blind score between Dale and I and come up with the same score, then maybe there's an opportunity to change the documentation or the training or something to that effect. And everybody loved having a score of partial, 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 which meant it was more than 1% affected, but less than 99% affected in 2. So having a CIA of partial meant somewhere between nothing and everything. So we removed the middle 90% by having none, low, high in 3.x. 4.0, though, we're looking forward to really help the consumers understand the finesse of CVSS. Consumers that are simply taking the evil vendor's base score, putting it into an Excel spreadsheet, sorting by column C and patching based on the 9.8s before the 5.3s, may be missing some of the subtleties of it. So the importance of threat intelligence, environmental metrics is going to be stressed repeatedly, much like we did in 3X, where we said CVSS base score is not risk. What we're going to try to do is work back toward what everybody wants, which is patch priority. The urgency of the 100,000 vulnerabilities you have to consume every year. We also realize, especially when gas prices go up due to pipelines being ransomwared, that there's some importance on OT, operational technology, and safety. If you've got a vulnerability in your Tesla that causes it to take a right like Wile E. Coyote off a cliff, that may be a higher CVSS score than 7.5, although currently that's simply an availability impact. So there's more to be understood regarding the OT, the ICS world. We also have additional color or facets we're calling supplemental metrics. Automatable is something wormable. Is a single packet of death something that is forwarded then crashes so that you take out the entire internet with one packet, or is it something that stops at the first vulnerable component? Recovery, if you have something that restarts automatically where you barely realize you were just exploited, that's different than having something that just corrupts BIOS, for example, and then you end up having to return it to Intel Bruce to have it reflashed. So there's some impact required, but they're not in the BTE math. They're just supplemental concepts. And mitigation effort. How hard is it to defend? Is it simply a documentation change? Did you misunderstand the feature? Can you simply set up a firewall filter and you're all set? Do you have to disable a subsystem just temporarily, or do you have to unplug the Juniper router and put it in a closet because there's no other mitigation required? Available, I should say. And then vendor supplied severity and impact scoring. Many major vendors have a base score, but then they give the CVSS vector that could be pivoted upon to decide whether you believe Juniper thinks this is a terrible, terrible issue, even though it's only a 7.5. We're also adding granularity, I guess you could call it. Right now, user interaction is yay or nay. There's either a human other than the attacker involved, or there is no human other than the attacker involved. But there are some software packages that require what you could call atypical user interaction, the shooting yourself in the foot sort of scenario, where there are some things where you could simply exist, the human could exist, and that's user interaction. And there are others where you really have to download a file, double click it, ignore the warning that says, are you sure you really shouldn't be doing this? Oh yes, I would like to do this. Well, that's also user interaction, but it's all on the same level playing field. Wouldn't it be cool if we had levels of user interaction that could be scored in the base metric? And then attack complexity has had challenges in the past because it's either complex or not that complex. Well, there are certain pieces of software that try to do things to defend you against bad people automatically. And in order to exploit a vulnerability like that, you need to have requirements for the attack to planet align to be successful. So we're adding more granularity there with attack complexity and requirements. And finally, or not necessarily finally, nomenclature. Since many people simply say the CVSS score, they mean the base score, but for those of you that are using the full suite of CVSS, including threat and environmental, wouldn't it be nice to highlight the fact that you're using the CVSS BTE score, base, threat, and environmental? So that's nomenclature. Here's a list of our approved proposals. When you're too close to a tree, you can't tell if it's an elephant or a tree, and you think you might not be doing much week by week, but then you kind of roll back a little bit and say, oh, look at that, we actually did some things. So these are the approved proposals that have occurred over the last little while. I touched on some of these, but the temporal metric group, which we all know and ignore, is now called the threat metric group. Remediation level and report confidence, which nobody really fully understood or embraced, have been removed. Exploit code maturity, because there are exploits that aren't necessarily code, has been updated and upgraded to exploit maturity. As I mentioned earlier, we now have attack requirements as a base metric. Scope had some corner cases that were not self-evident in the base vector, the base metric vector. So instead of simply being changed unchanged, now it denotes whether the scope is based on the vulnerable component. The impact score is based on the vulnerable component or impacted component, because letter of the law of CVSS is that you say scope changed and then you reevaluate CIA. So there were corner cases where you would have scope changed, but CI and A were based on the vulnerable component, not the impacted component, which was a little misleading. So now we have a tri-state value for scope. Nomenclature, CVSS BTE I had mentioned, and the new supplemental metric group, which I think is way cool. It doesn't impact the BTE score, but it does give an additional flavor or elements of a vulnerability that can be pivoted upon in a risk management dashboard. The user interaction granularity has been enhanced to be non-active passive. We have approved the supplemental metric called automatable, which aligns with SSVC by CertCC and SEI. This is a concept of whether an attack can be, what's the best way to say it? Attack has some sort of motility to it, where one attack can cause multiple impacts as opposed to a single attack. Wormable is a classic example. You know, the old code red, you would say, well, the score may be fairly low, but it took out, you know, lots and lots of components. So it was an automatable vulnerability. And repudiation, yes, that's how you say it, was clarified for integrity. A vulnerability that, as part of its attack, removes any trace of it attacking your device is a bit sneaky. And there's currently in the documentation, there's no way to really score something that does that sinister thing. So we're rewriting the integrity section of the impact metrics to explicitly state that repudiation is included. The timeline, again, this is, you could argue that's a pat on our collective backs, but things have moved along quite well. In fact, I was part of this 3.0 and 3.1 CVSS efforts, and in 3.1, we had a line between whether this was going to change the math or was going to introduce a new base metric or not. And one of our active members of the SIG came up with attack requirements. We thought it was brilliant, and it came out in 2017, or was approved in 2017. However, it would have changed the math and added metrics to 3.1, which was, you know, according to our hen scratch rules against the rules. So it was saved for 4.0. So even before the first board approved 3.1, we already had a 4.0 proposal that was approved back in 2017 for attack requirements. The other ones I've covered already. In early 2020, we massaged the temporal metric group, removed the things nobody loved, renamed it for its sole purpose, which is threat analysis. We updated scope mid-year. We added a technical severity definition. Right now, the base score is considered the severity of the vulnerability, but it's not clear in the documentation that that is scoped as the technical severity. It is the attack vector. It's the user interaction. These things don't really define risk. They define the technical severity. Severity is more apt to be considered after you analyze the threat and your environment. Exploit maturity, we mentioned the threat metric was renamed from code to exploit, and the language was massaged to be a lot more clear on not only the types of maturity, but the definitions and the lines. And that took a surprising amount of debate, but we do have a well-vetted and mother-approved version of exploit maturity now. Talked about BTE. Supplemental metric group was added at the end of the last year. It was a fairly interesting kind of out of the box thought to have a metric group added that adds no numeric value, but in fact adds orthogonal elements to the or aspects of the vulnerability. So I think that will be added to over time. In fact, a lot of the proposals that we have in the pipeline are going to be supplemental metrics that will, I would think, help aid in the analysis of a vulnerability and its impact to your business. Repudiation we talked about. Expanded user interaction, that was a multi-year effort that was finally approved to the delight of Daniel from Microsoft in April 2021, and Jono from CertCC got through the automatable supplemental metric just recently. So when do you hook me off the stage, Sean? Is it the bottom of the hour?
We've got a little bit of flexibility built in, so if you've got more, go ahead and keep talking, and I've got a couple questions for when you're ready.
Oh, okay, excellent. Well, then these are the proposed work items that are in the pipeline. Recovery mitigation effort. Provider-specific urgency is the latest word salad that I've used to define what the Intels and the Microsofts and Cisco's and Red Hats of the world are providing as additional information regarding severity. The original words were not loved as much as I thought they would be. Kinetic or safety impact, that's the OT world where we've got two excellent people working in collaboration with other ISACs and other standards bodies to come up with something that uses the same language and grammar and taxonomy for what it means to have a dangerous Tesla versus what it means to have a fish tank with a PLC that fails. It's more complex than one would expect. Additional threat metrics are the hope. Because risk is sort of the end game for what CVSS is used for, correctly or incorrectly, we're going to be publishing a best current practices addendum for how to use CVSS I wouldn't say correctly, to more better define risk for your business or your consumer environment. We've talked about a couple of the ones with question marks. Would it make sense to have an undefined value for base metrics? Would it make sense to bring back target distribution? And we can always use more scope clarification. So of course that's going to be in there. We have a bit.ly link, which is CVSS v4-work items. So feel free to click that. It goes to a Google Doc that I swear is safe and gives you kind of what we've done, what we were thinking, who the sponsors are for the various proposals. And if you've got comments, please add them. And then the last is what every SIG, I'm sure, on this call is saying, please get involved. If you've got ideas, that we haven't thought of, if you think we're completely off base, if you just want to hang out and drink coffee on mute while we talk about CVSS, as long as you're willing to sign an IPR agreement, you can be an active participant in the CVSS SIG. We meet at 1300 ET on Thursdays, and how to get involved, we've got a way cool URL, first.org CVSS, and an email, cvss@first.org. And I believe that's the end of me. There's my way cool Q&A.
Awesome. Ooh, I like that. Even though the cube looks backwards to me. But then again, my mic's not working great, so who am I to judge?
Oh, maybe your mic's in backwards. That could be the problem.
In my head, one of the two. Couple of quick questions. One is just to reiterate on the participation you're looking for. Are you all open to folks who are not members at first, as long as they sign?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yep. We take all comers. First, membership is not a requirement to be on the CVSS mailing list or as an active participant. Active participation, however, requires an IPR agreement, because if you come up with something brilliant, we want it. We don't want you to make money off of it.
Yes, and just to reiterate, the things that First does, we do not make money off of. These are things that we give free license out to the world in most cases. So,
yes.
Yeah, awesome. Second question for you. As you were all mentioning, is that most of us use the base score, and that's the one score we release if we release the score with our information. And I know from my personal experience in the past, the environmental score I always found a little tricky, because I'm thinking, I don't know everybody's environment, and most of them aren't going to have my environment. So how do how would you coax someone into starting to look into the environmental score and starting to get comfortable with releasing that information?
Okay, Dale, can you take that one?
Yep, I'll take this one. So this is one of my specialties. So the environmental scores and the threat scores for that matter. So anything that falls into the temporal or the environmental area, that is the responsibility of the consumer, the people like me, to fill in those values, because it's going to be different for every environment and for every system within that environment. And there's a number of different strategies that you can use to employ those in an automated way. I'm actually putting together a deck and a presentation and a guide that will provide some of these strategies to individual consumers.
That is excellent, excellent. Well, gentlemen, thank you both very much for being here today. I can't wait to see again the work that you all are doing. I have to admit, I was a little disappointed when we didn't see 4.0 come out, because we were getting all excited, but NVIDIA has updated to 3.1. And thanks to our cohort in Lund. But I'd like to thank you again for presenting today. And folks, if you are interested, definitely this is a great SIG to belong to, and doing lots of good work. And with that, gentlemen, I will wish you a good day.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Awesome. So we've got a moment or two, so we'll let the next speaker get ready. Now, I have to throw this out here. I'm the next speaker. The ethics SIG, we had a presentation late last night, my time, very early yesterday morning. I'm not time zone efficient. And so my cohort is probably not going to be able to join us today. So you'll give me just a minute. I'll kind of do a little hokey pokey, and we'll get started here in just a moment. Thanks. Alrighty, Grace, I am ready to share my slides if I may. There we go. Let's see if we can do this right. It would help if I get it to the right page. 1 second. I'm not trying to lie. I'm really not. We'll just go. There we go. All right. Can everyone see my screens? Make sure. Can everyone hear me? There we go. Awesome. I think we are good to go.
Yep.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Sean Richardson, and at this point, I'm taking off my my SIG liaison hat and putting on my ethics special interest group hat today. Jeroen Vanderham, who is my co-chair, is unfortunately unable to join us this morning. We were at got to present our ethics code of ethics to the Australian CERT convention conference, excuse me, about 12 hours ago. It went really well, got some good questions, and so we're very excited to be getting that messaging out and about. But right now, I just kind of want to update you on what we've been doing and how things are looking from the ethics SIG. See if I can figure out how to make this work. There we go. So just a quick reminder for those who may have forgotten all the glorious things we've done. Ethics First is, we came up with a group of 12 duties that we believe security teams and incident response teams should consider. These are not written as a you must, they are written as suggestions. So it makes it kind of easy to say, you know, we endorse this even if we can't follow it to the T. The one thing I think that the SIG did that was very good is dealing with dilemmas. I think most of us know, you know, man, if our world were just black and white, it would be so much easier. But I think a lot of us deal in some of the gray areas of security. And it's, you know, how do you make those tough decisions? How do you adjust for things when you're getting more information? How do you make sure you're protecting people's rights while doing your investigations and all these different things that come into play, not just with external forces, but with internal forces within your own organizations sometimes. So I won't read through all these, but this is the group that we had come out with. This has actually been translated into the 4 other UN languages at this point, so it's out there and released. Time to complete. Now here's the fun part when you're presenting and doing this is I can't see my notes. So hang on 1 second. I did want to leave this in here because this is one of Jeroen's slides. And basically what this speaks to is when you're having to make these decisions, when you're coming up with your code, when you're utilizing your code and trying to figure out what decision you should be making and trying to address those dilemmas, having someone else to talk to about it is incredibly helpful. Now, in this case, I was talking to Rubber Ducky, definitely showing our age as we were both Sesame Street kids. But, you know, having that second set of eyes, having that second set of ears, those other experiences when you're making these decisions can be very important. So the progress we've made, as I said, we have now launched. If you go out to ethicsfirst.org, we're there with all of our 12 duties in glory. It's been translated from English into the 5 other languages. And our first draft of case studies has been completed. Now, probably thinking, what the heck are case studies? As we're bringing this up, we want other organizations to be able to utilize this. Initially, this was taken up, we were thinking of creating a code of conduct, code of ethics. We already have a code of conduct for FIRST. You know, what would that look like? And as the city came up with this and shared it with the board back in Edinburgh, they were incredibly excited and said, we should make this available more broadly. This is something other teams could use, other organizations could use, either to strengthen their existing code or to create a new one. And so we went back and kind of did a little more cleaning up and then thought, well, some of these are kind of, again, playing in the gray. How do you help define what these looks like and the way you should think about things, or not necessarily the way you think about things, but things to consider as you're forming your own. And so for each of the duties, we have come up with a brief case study, here's kind of the scenario, here's what could possibly go wrong, and here's how you can use this code to potentially mitigate the risks in those decisions. We have the rough draft done. We definitely need a little more work on it, and definitely looking for a few more sets of eyes. Also, as I mentioned, we presented this at OSCERT, and Yaron is actually doing a podcast, and he's going to have that link available later for other discussions going on with what we've done on the ethics SIG. Our next steps, we're looking for organizations and companies who are willing to endorse the code. Not meaning that you're signing up saying you're going to follow it letter for letter. It's specifically written in very general terms so as not to be abhorrent to one's legal representation potentially. But we're looking for folks who will support this and say, yeah, we think this is a good idea. We need to complete the case duties for each of the duties. This is where we definitely need some help. We definitely need some new sets of eyes, people with different experiences, people from different regions to help us look through these things and define kind of what are the considerations we need to make. And then once we've done that, we want to create some training content around this. Things that are going to help new organizations who want to establish a code of ethics. I think having the information in different ways is very helpful because not everybody, reads something and can get something out of it. Sometimes having an interaction or having a different kind of training is helpful. So with that, I'm going to say, please come join us. We are open to any participation. You do not need to be a member of FIRST to join. We have 2 meetings, one that is Europe East Coast friendly and one that is West Coast and Asia Pacific friendly. So please contact us and we will we'll get you in the group and get you access and start getting some help on all the work we have left for us over the year. And with that, I will say thank you, and I will stop sharing my screen and see if there are any questions. And if you have questions, the Q&A bottom bar, there we go. I think that coffee hit again, is at the bottom. Otherwise, I'd like to thank you very much, and we will have the next set of speakers get ready, and we will go from there. So just one moment. And we will get the women of FIRST lined up here. Just a moment. Okay. Okay, my apologies. We have ended a little sooner than we had expected because we planned to have 2 of us and taking a smidge more longer than my rush through there. We will go ahead and we're going to start back at 50 after. So give us about 5 minutes. We'll get everybody on board and continue at that point. Again, if you're seeing any SIG work that looks interesting to you today, please reach out. If you didn't catch the alias of the group, you can go out to first.org and the SIGs are listed on the left nav bar and with details on how to reach folks, including our FIRST secretariat as a contact of last resort. Not wanting to inundate her with tons of email, but we will get you in contact, and if the SIG is accepting new members, get you signed up. And with that, I'm going to take a short break and we'll be back here in just about a moment or 2. Thank you very much. Excellent. We have Swati and Amir are going to be joining us. We'll give them a moment to get set up because we're running a little ahead of schedule. So they are going to be talking about the Women of First. Women of First is currently Birds of a Feather, the WAF BOF. We have Marguerite to thank for that name. I've been very blessed to have been involved with the group, and I'm very excited to see the direction they're going and the things they're going to be working on. And ladies, if you're ready, we will go ahead and give you control to share your screen, whoever's presenting. If anyone has questions during this, please use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and I will ask the chairs the questions towards the end of their presentation. Excellent. And with that, your screen is showing. I think you're both off mute, and I will let you all take it away. Thank you very much.
Sure. Swati, will I let you go? Yep. Perfect. Go ahead.
Thank you. Hey all, thanks for having us here. I'm Swati Joshi. I lead the detection and response team at Netflix. With me is Emer O'Neill, who leads the product security incident response team at VMware. We are the co-chairs of Women of First. So I want to start by obviously thanking Sean Richardson, who started this initiative and kind of ignited the fire for us. So, first update is Sean has passed the baton over to us, and we are really excited to move this forward. So thanks, Sean. Emer, do you want to move to the next slide? Our goal, obviously with your partnership, is to make sure First is an inclusive place for everyone, right? So we want to improve sort of cognitive diversity on our technical products in the IR discipline and in the overall industry itself. So as a byproduct of that, one of the challenges is it's hard to measure inclusion. While it's possible to measure demographic information associated with diversity, inclusion is more of a qualitative experience. It requires kind of each of us as individuals. It makes it hard to know the difference at work, in our profession, and in our work. So we wanted to, in the last 1 year, we've had monthly WAF BOF sessions. So all the women kind of across First various geographical locations, we would meet once a month. And this was mainly a discovery exercise to figure out, who we are, what do we want to do, and what are some of the problems that folks are facing, especially sort of in the ground. So we chatted about a bunch of things. A few ideas came about. We chatted about recruiting and hiring and how additive hiring can be a piece to that. We chatted about sort of, burden of response and burnout and how that could be unique to specific underrepresented groups. We chatted about making opportunities for each other. We chatted about the mentorship program. We chatted about how we wanted to do more sort of technical talks. So there was a whole kind of spectrum of things that, various people kind of came together to chat about. So from those sort of list of ideas, as a next step, we want to take that and we want to formalize our mission and our goals, and also have specific targets around what do we want to do sort of in the next year. So this is, I guess I'll kind of stop there and see if folks have any questions. So this is sort of the origins so far, what we have done in the last 1 year, and what our thought process is around forming this group. So I'll pause there and see if any questions.
I think, thank you all very much for the nod. I think one of the things I would just add is that when we came up with this in Edinburgh, we did it spare the moment we had no previous announcement. I think we literally sent out, maybe an email went out, but I know a little note went up on the BOF board down in the lobby, and we were expecting maybe a handful of folks might be interested. We ended up having to open walls in some of the side rooms, and I think we had close to 90 or 100 people literally screeched into. Thank goodness the fire folks weren't there, so I think we were breaking a few fire codes. So there's definitely an appetite for this. There's definitely women and allies who want to participate. And considering where we have been with COVID over the last year, the fact that we still had a good attendance in our meetings was just phenomenal. And I just want to thank those who continue to carry the torch.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good call out, and something that I wanted to bring up as well. Generally we have seen that underrepresented groups and women specifically are at the burnout spectrum a lot more during the pandemic, right? Like obviously, caregiving responsibilities, playing various other conventional roles in the society that of course puts a lot of burden on us. And it was definitely reflected as well in the last 1 year, right? Like myself included, would have these meetings at 7 in the morning, and I'm trying to get my kids ready and also join the meeting. So yeah, I think a huge accomplishment from everyone in terms of like giving this time. As I think a byproduct of that, quick update, in the last sort of 1 year, we were also able to kind of recruit like 3 of us, right? Like Emer, myself, and Kristen, who is part of Airbnb, has graciously volunteering to join as well. And I know we're chatting with 1 more person. So I think having a team of 4 people will definitely help us scale this. So with that, that's kind of our perspective on what's been going on in the last year. I'll pass it on to my co-chair here to talk through future.
Sure, thanks, Swati. So as Swati said earlier, Emer O'Neill is my name, and I head up the PCERT at VMware. So I suppose what are our future plans, and really what we want to do is, as Swati mentioned, last year was a lot about discussions, nothing really formalized, and obviously very good discussions. But this year and going forward, we do want to kind of work towards becoming a SIG through defining, we have our mission statement, but defining some key goals that we want to accomplish throughout the course of the year. And now that we have broadened our team, so we have an extra person in VMware as well, Harshita, who's based out of our India office, is going to help support. So we'll have 4 people supporting this. So I suppose I just wanted to highlight some of the ideas that we have and that we really want to start pushing forward with. First and foremost, I think it's about having some form of a mentorship program, and when we talk about a mentorship program, I think the first and last bullet point tie in nicely. The mentorship program might be number 1 for folks within the SIG, right? So how can we mentor our own to help them, become more involved in FIRST or other areas, and build up, I suppose, confidence to be able to, put forward talks, get involved in workshops or whatever that might be. And I think, that's inward, and then looking outward, is there opportunity for us to, coach more younger folks, maybe target schools, colleges, and have a session there, or be involved in, some sessions that they're having, so that we can kind of, highlight, what a career in cybersecurity is about, and how to encourage more diverse students at that level, to kind of build up excitement around this area. Another area we'd like to run with is kind of maybe some sort of series of D&I talks delivered by the members of the SIG, or the BOF as it is right now. And I think this again will tie in with the mentorship. It's around like, how do we, maybe perhaps it's videos or something, to kind of focus on our career journeys, maybe the challenges that we've had, who's inspired us, and what skills that you need to build up. So like, again, kind of influence the younger generation to build up that more diversity in the area. Another area that we think might be good is invite some external speakers to our sessions, just to educate the folks in the BOF around, how to, what's an effective way to deliver a presentation, or what other examples, even for maybe something in terms of our own career, and how could we kind of build up our own career. So kind of target a number of different kind of speakers to come. I think another area might be, how do we, encourage people to apply for the board and first. So maybe some board member come in and talk to us and say, this is my journey, and this is how you could go about it. So they're just some ideas we have. I think what one really has come up from a lot of people is around some sort of buddy system. So what I often hear, and what I've often experienced myself, is I've gone to conferences and I'm, one of a very minority of females there, and it's difficult to kind of open up at a seat at a table. Like I've sat at a table that's all men, and I find I sit quietly. I don't really engage because I'm there on my own, and you don't have that confidence. So we feel some sort of buddy system might. So if you had another female or even a male ally going with you, kind of help break that ice. And this has come up just in discussions here and other multiple discussions I've had from in other forums I'm part of, and I do think this will be a real key one for us. And really, I suppose, ultimately, our goal is to progress to more diverse inclusion. Like we're looking at female now, right? But we do need to look at the other areas, underrepresented minorities. There's so many other different areas. So we're starting small and maybe scale it out over time. And then the last one we had there is around our allies. And I think really that's something that we need to do more of as well, is encouraging. It's not just going to be our as we broaden out this and build up a SIG, maybe we have male allies join as well. It's not just females there, because it's great to have their perspective for them to understand the challenges that we may face and see how they could support us. So yeah, so look, there's just some ideas we have. Our Swati and myself hope to kind of formalize this as we go out throughout the year, and hopefully by this time next year we'll have delivered upon some of these goals and have been successful. So feel free to ask any questions.
Excellent. One of the questions here is, do people need to be members of FIRST to participate in your SIG?
Correct. Yes.
They do need to be a member.
Yes.
Okay, so only members, no non-members in the SIG. Okay.
There has been, though, interest, but for now, this is for members only.
Okay, no, I think that's totally fair. That's very good. This all looks great. I'm very excited to see where you all take this. One of the questions is, what challenges are you seeing at moving this forward? We've seen some of the discussions where, I think people tend to think that, we're putting together a women's SIG and everybody's on the same page. What has been your experience so far?
Yeah, so good question. I think with any kind of grassroots type movement, there is the challenge of getting people together and moving forward, right? So it's all been, hey, everyone's volunteering their time. They have a bunch of other stuff going on. So I think our first step for both of us is to form that core team and make sure that the four folks on that team, like, we carve out the time to say, yep, this is a priority. This is what we need to do. From there, what we plan to do is sort of 4 different work streams aligned with the goals that Emer has on the screen here. So let's say if we want to do a mentorship program, then we want sort of one person from the core committee to take lead, and then maybe recruit 2 more people to kind of push that forward. So we want to have sort of these 4 sub work streams within Women of First, and then go sort of tackle that parallelly. And as co-chairs, we'll kind of take the responsibility to say, okay, we need 4 or more people, and then they'll recruit a few more people, and then kind of get that engagement going. So we need to get a bit more formal, and we need to sort of get a little bit more into recruiting folks to join our committee who can then put in the time. So those have been the couple of challenges, Sean.
Excellent, excellent. Great. Well, thank you, ladies, very much. We're at the top of the hour. Again, very excited to see the work that you're doing. I can't wait to partner with you as the SIG liaison and helping in any way I can. And with that, I would like to thank all of you who have joined us today. This has been our second round of SIG updates. If you will join us next Thursday, as we say, same bat time, same bat channel, we will have updates from the DNS of USIG, the academic SIG, and the cyber insurance SIG. So again, thank you for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you next Thursday. And thanks to all of our participants today for giving their updates and showing all the amazing work that the first SIGs are doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.